This is a production of Cornell University.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and to everyone for, coming out on what's been obviously a very crazy and stressful semester for everyone. So I really appreciate when anyone does anything extra right now. And I'm definitely impressed by the scope of the audience. So I really appreciate you coming. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So thank you so much for that introduction. I am LauraAnne Minkoff-Zern. I teach at Syracuse University in our food studies program. I'm also the graduate director there. So I'll just do a little plug on our program because it's still relatively new. But we teach about food studies and food systems. We have an undergraduate program as well as a master's degree program. And it's a mix of the critical social sciences, and then students also get to take advantage of the Maxwell Policy School, as well as some students doing some coursework at ESF that want a bit more of the applied agriculture side of things. But we think it's a pretty unique program. I feel very lucky to have landed here in Syracuse, and I get to teach about food and food systems and sustainability all the time, which is really wonderful for me. But I'm going to talk a bit about the research that I've been doing for the past, I guess the book now, by the time the book actually gets published, and then all the writing period. So I really finished the research about 3 years ago. But the book came out at the end of last year, called The New American Farmer, Immigration, Race, and the Struggle for Sustainability. And this is just a photo of the book. It's with MIT Press, and I always like to tell people that you can get it open access. You can download it for free. It's one of the books that MIT made open source last year. So especially for grad students that can't just buy every book they want to read, I'm really proud to have it available to anyone that wants to read it if you want to download it from the press site. That is, of course, if you find this talk interesting enough that you want to hear more. So this book and the talk today is the study that I did over the course of about 8 years, looking at Latino and Latina immigrant farmers in the United States. And I've chosen to, at least for this publication, use the term Latino and Latina rather than Latinx, simply because that's how people identified themselves to me in interviews, and I wanted to honor how people were identifying themselves. So my study is qualitative. I'll go a little bit into my methods and how I did my research in a minute. But I do always like to point that while my study is qualitative, it's interview based, and I can't make a lot of quantitative claims based on my own research. It is backed up by quantitative research done by the USDA Census. So my study looked at Latino and Latina immigrant farmers in the United States. And I specifically was doing research with farm workers that identified as immigrants, as Latino, primarily from Mexico. And the census actually looks at a broader scale of self-identified Latino or Hispanic farmers. But what I found in my study and what is identified in the agricultural census is the same, which is that they are a growing group of farmers in the United States. And while the census is broader in terms of not everyone that's interviewed is first generation. So in my study, I looked specifically at first generation people that came and worked in farm work and then started their own farms. What we also see from the broader numbers is that Latino and Hispanic farmers are increasing, and they are the largest, most quickly growing self-identified ethnic group in agriculture today. So I think that's really significant, and it backs up everything that I'm going to talk about today in terms of why we should care about this group of farmers, what they bring to agriculture, and the types of shifts that we're seeing, as well as the ways that they are disadvantaged, the challenges that they face, and what we can possibly do to better incorporate them into agrarian systems in the US. So why this is really important if we're looking at broader shifts in US agriculture. We know that half of all farm operators are reaching retirement. And so we really do have a gap in terms of who wants to farm and who's willing to farm in the United States if we are interested in maintaining local agriculture and regional agriculture systems. We've seen that most people born into farming families in the US are not interested in taking on the farm. Obviously, everyone here already knows why. It's really economically difficult to survive in farming in the US, in the global labor market, or the global market, as well as the amount of labor input and how physically challenging and difficult it is as a business. At the same time, we see a higher demand for organic food than we can even grow in the US, and you'll see why that's significant. As well as a higher demand for regional and local food, which arguably is growing during the pandemic, as we saw kind of people being the fear of supply chain shutting down. And while that didn't happen, the demand for things like CSAs and local food seems to be going up. And yet, right, we don't have the farmers coming in with the experience and interest in continuing the types of medium and small scale farms that I'll talk about, right? So arguably what we have is a population of farm workers that have the experience and skill in farming, many of whom actually want to own farms in the US, but don't have the capital and other types of advantages to start those farms. And so that's kind of the gap that we're seeing, and some of the ways that immigrants could be filling the gap, and in some ways are. So I like to start with one of the quotes. This is one of the quotes in the beginning of the book by one of the farmers that I met in Washington State. And I always ask the farmers, why are they doing this? A bit of their story, and I'll talk much more about, that they do this against so many odds. But to describe what their motivation was. And this one farmer said to me, and her farm is Mariposa Farm, of course, which means butterfly in Spanish. She said, we wanted to name it Mariposa because, do you know the story of the monarchs, the monarch butterflies? They need to fly from Mexico to Canada. Some of them die crossing the border to reach Canada. Some of the parents die during the trip, but children know how to come back. I think we as Latinos have a lot in common with butterflies because in order to be here, we have to cross the borders. And sadly, a lot of times families lose their loved ones. But their children here, the children who are born here, always have the need of knowing their parents' roots and always go looking for it. And that represented a lot of the narratives that I heard from different farmers, is the ways that starting a farm in the US was not just a business, but a way to establish roots, to revisit the traditions and culture that they had been raised in Mexico, and also to teach their children about who they were and where they were from. And so I met with the small farm program at Cornell this morning, and someone in the meeting said, is there motivation for them outside of economic motivation? And yes, that was largely what I found, is there was something more meaningful to them as to why they were continuing to farm, against so many odds. So to scale out a bit, the larger book project, and I'm not going to answer all of these questions today because that's too many questions to answer. But what I write about in the book is I look at, right, why are they starting their farms despite challenges? I look a lot at the historic context that's determined their position in the current agri-food system. What's the relationship between slavery, African-American farmers, and immigrant farmers today? I look specifically at how race, ethnicity, and their citizenship affect agricultural practices and their identity. And what this transition from workers to owners, as I say, my work really focuses specifically on farm workers starting their own farms. What does it mean for potentially labor justice? So I started out my research specifically working with farm workers in my dissertation, and I was really interested, and I still am very interested, in farm worker and farm labor issues. And that was the lead into this project. And then, of course, what does this group of farmers mean for alternative agri-food movements? What might it mean to the types of more sustainable and socially just changes that we'd like to see in agriculture today? So I'm going to narrow it down today to just 3 of those questions. So why are they starting their own farms? How does their race, ethnicity, and citizenship affect their practices and identity? And then what's their role in these growing food movements? Of course, there's a lot of literature that influences me and the work that I do. In a way, I bring together a lot of work in agrarian political economy with and political ecology with work on agrarian cultural and racial identity. So the importance not only of kind of structures in agriculture in terms of class structure and class transition, but also the importance of identity and culture to agrarian transition, as well as the ways that food and agriculture and foodways are a form of resistance to the industrial food system, to the ways that people are exploited and oppressed in the food system, as well as the ways that people have historically lost their own food traditions. And so I draw on a lot of different scholars that look at food as a form of cultural resistance. So this is a bit about where I did my research. So it was across the United States. And in a lot of ways, this research really followed me and my own path in life in a very practical way. I started my research in the northern central coast of California when I was doing dissertation work in largely Monterey, Salinas, Santa Cruz counties in California. When I came to the East Coast to do my postdoc work in Baltimore, I started doing some work in the northern neck of Virginia, about 3 hours south of Washington, D.C. And then once I had established really 2 field sites and started doing some presentations, what I found is different people in conferences and different places would reach out to me and say, you need to come here, you need to look at this community, I'll host you, I'll introduce you to people, but there are Latino farmers where I'm working too. And that's how I really ended up in Washington and Minnesota and the Hudson Valley. And of course, this is by no means comprehensive of all the places across the United States that I think immigrant farmers and Latino farmers specifically are succeeding and have pockets. There are so many more places I could have done the work, but at a certain point, I wanted to write the book. So what I found is really, I think in most areas that have large immigrant farm worker populations, where they have proximity to an urban area for direct sales, you will find immigrant farming communities. So as I said, this work really looks at this agricultural transition or agrarian transition. So everyone that I interviewed that was farming here in the US started out in some way farming in Mexico. The vast majority were from Mexico, all different parts of Mexico. A few I interviewed were from Central America as well. But most of them started off farming in their life in their home country. They came here to work in the fields, mostly in industrial monocrop agriculture, depending on whatever region they were in. Some of them were migrant workers in the US. Some of them had worked in northern Mexico before they came here. But largely they were going from very diversified, small scale agriculture to monocrop industrial scale agriculture in the United States. And then they were returning to some form of small to medium scale farming and diversified farming again in the US. So they went from farmer to farm worker to farmer again. And all of them really identified as a farmer throughout that entire path. And so I think a lot of farm workers in the US identify as farmers, even when they don't have their own land, right? Even when they don't have access to make those types of decisions. And a lot of people would ask me when I started this work is, how can someone do farm work on someone's farm all day and then have their own farm in the evening? Because many of them had not made enough money to quit their day jobs. And so they do their own farming in the evening and the weekends. But what I saw was that what they did in their day job was very, very different than what they were doing after work. So in the Salinas Valley, they might be picking strawberries all day long with a crew or planting garlic, a very, very repetitive task where they didn't get to make any decisions about how the crop was planted, what they were planting, when it was picked, right? Nothing. They were workers. They were told what to do. And after work, they would go to their own plot of land, which they would rent or own, mostly renting. And they'd be with their extended family. They would be in charge of what was planted. They got to make decisions. They were paying attention to the weather. They were the farmer, right? They were the decision maker. They were doing tons of different jobs every single day, as you do on a small farm. And it was just an incredibly different experience to them than working on someone else's farm. And it was worth it, right? Which I'll talk about kind of why. Why would they do this? So first, the story of, as I've been saying, it's kind of this balance between challenges and opportunities that the farmers are experiencing. So of course, the biggest, as first generation immigrants to the US, are race and citizenship based. So things such as language, the vast majority, Spanish was their first language. Many of them had no to very little English skills. In California in particular, and some in Washington state, I interviewed a lot of self-identified Mexican indigenous farmers. So Triqui and Mixteco were their first languages, and then they learned Spanish in Mexico, and then they were trying to learn English here. And most had not been, beyond middle school. Some had not been beyond elementary school. So not only were they not reading and writing in English, many of them could barely read and write in Spanish. So a real lack of formal education, which in the United States, farming is actually quite bureaucratic. If you want to be part of a farmer's market, you have to fill out forms. If you want to own land, you have to fill out forms. If you want a business license, if you want to be certified organic, right? There's tons of paperwork. And while, a lot of people have said to me, if you want to apply to loans or to work on with any type of extension, a lot of people have said to me, well, no farmers like paperwork, right? No one goes into farming to do paperwork, which of course is true. To have to do that level of paperwork when you can't read and write in English is a whole other barrier that keeps farmers out of accessing particular resources and networks. As well as learning how to market in the context of the United States, which is very different from their home communities. Just the whole concept of marketing and creating a brand and these types of things. And then, of course, some of them were explicitly limited by citizenship status. So I never asked about citizenship status, but I could usually kind of, figure it out along the lines of their immigration story. And some people, if they were undocumented, of course, had to, similar to Japanese farmers during the internment period, would, turn over their licenses to US born children or neighbors, or have someone help them that had certification. And, many of them also would experience overt discrimination, which I really did not hear much stories of discrimination by customers. It was largely by other farmers and market managers. So farmers, market managers, as well as historical discrimination by the USDA. And I'll go a little bit into that in a minute. What I realized I actually didn't say in the method slide, maybe I'll go back just one second, is so my methods for this was all long form interview based. I interviewed about 70 farmers, and 30 people in either extension, USDA, regional USDA, federal USDA, market managers, nonprofits, and farm incubators, basically anyone I could find that worked with immigrant farmers and could tell me about their work with them. I met a lot of farmers through people that were working in incubators, farm incubators, or market managers, and then things would kind of, extend from there, where I would get to know these extended networks, family networks, community networks of farmers. But all in all, it was about 100 interviews over the course of 8 years, and different kind of trips to each site, multiple trips. So back to kind of the obstacles or limitations. I always ask people if they had ever reached out to Extension, if they'd ever reach out to USDA. And this is one farmer in California who is actually a relatively successful farmer. She had gone through the ALBA training program, one of the larger farm incubator training programs in California. She had started her own certified organic farm. She actually had a spot at many of the farmers markets in the Bay Area, which is very competitive. But when I asked, do you look for grants or loans or any kind of help? And there is help out there for small scale farmers, things like hoop houses, grants to help them with value-added products, that type of thing that a lot of small farmers in the US do access. And she said to me, well, if you go to an agency and you're a Latino person and you're a woman and you don't speak the language and you don't have money, and you go to an agency of the federal government and you want to find someone to speak your language, how do you say this? They don't want to have a person to help you. They don't want to have a person that speaks your language. And as we spoke, she clearly meant this not, she meant this metaphorically as well, right? First of all, there was no one in the office that spoke Spanish, even though the majority of people in these rural areas in California where farm workers live are Spanish speaking. But no one in her local USDA office spoke Spanish. But when she walked in, nobody really wanted to communicate with her because they assume she's a worker. And I had that really affirmed when I was doing my research. Every area that I was going to interview farmers, I would call local offices of the USDA and any extension if it existed. And I'd say, can I speak with anyone who works with immigrant farmers in your region? And I heard multiple times, well, we don't work with farm workers. That would be the labor department. And I'd say, no, farmers, I've been talking to farmers. And they'd say, well, we don't know what you're talking about. So many times they're just completely unaware that immigrant farmers exist, and they don't identify immigrants as farmers, right? It's not who they see as a farmer. Of course, this is not always true. I found in Washington State, there were a few staff at the USDA that grew up in farm worker families themselves that specifically did all the translation and outreach, that made it their personal mission to network to all the immigrant farmers in the area. But it's only because of their own personal background. It's not something they were being paid to do or had been hired to do. So if there wasn't an explicit effort, it was not happening. And so, of course, this has also been, seen historically, structurally. So people are usually more familiar with the Pigford case, the discrimination case of African-American farmers in the USDA, but there's also a Hispanic and women farmers. Women and Hispanic farmers were bunched together in this claims process. There's also a Native American farmers claims case. And this one was specifically in 2000, but when I was doing the early part of my research is actually when the claims process was being processed. So 15 years later, people had to hear about this. You could complain if you had been discriminated against while applying for a loan from 81 to 2000, which means that you would have had to be walking into a USDA office to see the paperwork saying, if you were discriminated, fill out the paperwork. Of course, it's already, if you've been discriminated against, you didn't get the loans, you didn't succeed in farming, it's really hard to ever hear that this is going on. But still, there were many people that filled out the forms, successfully, I should say applied, but not successfully, because in the end, something like 90% of the cases were thrown out because they said people didn't fill out the paperwork properly. Which of course to me is really ironic, seeing that one of the main practical barriers that people talked about was the ability to fill out paperwork. But in the end, right, there was acknowledgement from the USDA that this discrimination had happened, and that's why they had the claims process. So on the other side of this, right, I've talked about the barriers, I've talked about the, just gonna check on time. I've talked about the obstacles. So then it always came to me that one of the first questions I would ask, right, is, well, why are you doing this? This is so difficult, right? Anyone familiar with farming knows that farming is, economically difficult. It's hard labor, right? It's every odd is against you. Even if you're US born, even if you're born into a farming family, even if you have capital and resources, it's just very difficult. And you look at people that are coming here with very little money to invest, very little social networks, very little education in marketing or business skills, and they're still doing it. And what I really found, this had a lot to do with this sense of reclaiming their identity. And as I was saying, also reclaiming their labor, and that having their own farm was very different than working on someone else's farm. And so they talked to me a lot about this sense of recreating, home, recreating the sense of life in Mexico or life back home. That once they had acknowledged that they were going to stay here, that they wanted to make their life, what they were familiar with, and they wanted to teach it to their children. And this was reflected, as I was saying, in the scale. So most farms were anywhere from 4 acres to the biggest farm I think I saw was about 60 acres. And while they were not all certified organic, they used kind of low input, low spray, and a lot of them weren't certified simply because of the paperwork and cost of being certified. And since the book came out, I've actually been working a little bit with NOFA, the Northeast Organic Farming Association, on how to make all of their paperwork and their application process more accessible to Spanish-speaking immigrants. Because sometimes it's just that it has not been apparent, right, that they needed to have things in Spanish if they wanted to reach this audience. And that it can't be like 5 clicks to get to the Spanish-speaking form, right? It needs to be accessible from the get-go. So many of them, like I said, well, they were not certified. They would fall under the broad category of alternative agriculture, right? Very diversified, low inputs in terms of the scale of agriculture in the US today, and small scale, as well as direct marketing. And so while there were some farmers in California that just basically could not get into the markets because they were so saturated, all of them preferred direct markets. It was more familiar to them. It's how they had grown up farming. So that everything from farmers markets to sometimes selling directly to Mexican grocery stores, to directly to neighbors and people in their own community. And for them, again, it was this sense of controlling their day-to-day, their own labor, as well as preserving their own traditional foodways. And so even in a place where, say, they might have had to narrow it down to 3 crops, because that's what would sell at market. On the side, they would have their own, milpa or garden, so corn, beans, and squash, or more of a traditional diet that would feed their family. So no matter what, part of their field would be for their family. So it was about much more than a business, right? It was about recreating this sense of home and familiarity with agriculture for their family. So this is actually the one farmer that I interviewed in the Ithaca area, who I've been able to keep up with. And he said, it's part of our heritage that we want to be able to not get up at a certain time, but just jump in a car and not just jump in a car and leave your house. It's more a way of life, being able to raise your kids at home, because everywhere we're from has their own farm. Every single person in town had their own farm. And, for him and his wife, it was very much about that family, about teaching their kids how to farm and being part of a local food system for their family. Another farmer in Virginia who had a really beautiful flower farm where she also had herbs and vegetables for the market. She said, life in the United States is very ugly. Everyone stays in their own house. There's no time. People live by their watch, and there's a lot of stress. And then, we were sitting in her living room having coffee, and we were looking at her farm. She's one of the farmers that actually did own her land. The land values in Virginia were very low when the farming community that I was interviewing started to settle there in the 80s. And she said, on her farm, it's a little bit like Mexico. It makes me feel the same. It's not the same exactly, but more free. In the city, there's more pressure. So for her, it's not just about the practice of being a farmer, it's about the livelihood that she could create there. So there's another farmer in California, and he was one of the farmers that was really in the Salinas Valley, like strawberry growing region, just everywhere is strawberries. His farm really, you could see this very visual contrast between this very diversified vegetable farm and the monocrop strawberries everywhere. And he said, I like the life of a farmer. I don't necessarily recommend it. You have to love agriculture. You need to love farming more than you love money. One of the first things is you have to love this. You can't do it for the money. That is part of farming, right? So why does he continue to farm against these barriers? And this is another California farmer. This was also in reference to kind of the question of why don't you farm like everyone around you? And he said, they do it for the money and I do it for the freedom, which I think is a really powerful statement in the context of people that have immigrated to the US, that have been working on other people's farms, and then choose farming as their way to find freedom on this side of the border. So as I was speaking to, I don't like to, it was hard in writing the book to figure out how to identify the farmers, right? Is it sustainable? Is it small scale? Is it local, right? And I really landed on alternative as a broad way to describe the farming I was seeing, right? Which is that it's relatively small scale, low input in terms of chemical additives, right, but not strictly. Very diverse. And I think that was one of the most defining features of every farm that I went to. Direct marketing, as well as prioritizing family labor. And of course, that doesn't, back to the question that I brought up of labor justice, right? Just because you have your family working on the farm doesn't mean that everything's equal and great. And I did not go very much into gender dynamics, given kind of the nature of my methods. Most farms, I visited one time, I maybe got to know them at a market, and then I was invited to their home. Most of the time, it was the male farmer. It was usually a male and female couple with children. And it was usually the male farmer was the farmer, even though I could always, the female part of the couple would usually kind of be like adding in all of this information. So clearly there were some gender dynamics going on. There always are. And I didn't really get to ask about that, just given that I was meeting with most farming families just one time. So all that is to say, just because it's family labor doesn't mean it's equal or perfect. But in this case, I think it's significant in terms of agrarian transition because the family labor was very intentional. They did not want to scale up for the most part. I'd say, do you want to get bigger? Do you want to, have more property? Do you want to have more employees? Do you want to grow more? And they mostly would say, no, I really don't. I'm happy at this scale. I want to make this work. I don't want to be in a position of hiring people like I was being hired. Because, at the end of the day, they can't afford to pay workers any more than they were paid, right? They're still in the same place of being stuck in terms of their income and their ability to do more for their workers. And so while they would say to me, oh, I was a worker, so I understand. And some of them did have some workers, some of them that had been around longer. I always give them breaks. I give them Gatorade. They weren't essentially very different employers than people they had worked for, except that they could speak Spanish and they might be friends. And I think that just goes to the structural constraints of agriculture in the United States today, where farmers are not making enough money. And not, for the most part, able to pay a lot of money. And these farmers were no different, even though they might have wanted to more than other farmers. So really, this leads us to a lot of questions, of course, as research always does. So immigrant farmers, I think, are really important to pay attention to because it's an opportunity for us to better understand the role of low resource farmers, of farmers of color broadly, and how to make them part, not just of the food system, but part of the alternative food system, which we know is a growing part of the food system. And there's a desire for, more regional, more organic foods, more local foods, right? I don't have to explain what that means. But while there's a real role for them to fill, because they have all of this knowledge and skills, they are under the same pressures that other farmers are, right? So what I did see was places where they'd say, well, I started out, with 40, 50 varieties, but I had to really narrow it down because the market I'm selling in, I can't sell it all. So then I had to start just selling tomatoes to this one, middle person cooler. So the pressure to be less diverse in terms of what they grow was very much there, especially in more competitive markets like the West Coast. And of course, if they're going to make it, oftentimes they felt they did have to scale up, even when that's not what they wanted, and to hire more non-family labor, meaning hire people at very low cost, which of course then, to this last point, reproduces some of the class inequalities and the labor issues that all of agriculture struggles with, and that I started in on this project wanting to find an answer or find some kind of solution. And I think ultimately, the issues are structural. So I do think that immigrant farmers play a very important role in our food system today, a very underappreciated role. There are a lot of ways we could be reaching out much more so, and making, especially regional food systems, places where they are more easily able to be a part of growing and marketing and selling their crops. And I think we have a lot to gain from that in terms of if we're interested in more ecological sustainability, because I always like to point out that they're the farmers, they know how to do this, right? They don't know how to market themselves. They don't know how to fill out the paperwork, but they do know how to farm, right? This isn't something they need to learn. And I think that's one of the things that new and beginning farmers are struggling with in the US today, if you don't come from an agriculture background. And what I see is that we have farms all over the US with sustainable farmers that don't have land. So how do we make that transition, I think is the question. So this is a quote from a farmer in Washington State that I interviewed. He was renting from a farm incubator called Viva. And he was Mixteco, so he was an indigenous immigrant, very young, still working his day job in the berry fields in Washington, and really still just very passionate and motivated to go out at the end of the day and do it again. Of course, when I asked him, why are you doing this? He said, if the sun comes out for everybody, why have envy? If it comes out for everyone, it comes out for the blondes, the Latinos, the Japanese, for everybody. The sun does not discriminate. The rain falls for every farmer. So I think it's a really beautiful image of kind of hope in the midst of a lot of destruction and challenges that our food system is experiencing right now. So of course I have my acknowledgements, my research assistance and funding and so forth. But yeah, I'll stop there, and hopefully I didn't go too long. I'm happy to answer questions that people have. Oh, Don, I think you're muted now.
Sorry. I think we've all been prey to that fault in this Zoom age. So questions for LauraAnne. And actually, I'll lead with one, which is, did you find that generally these Latina farm families wanted their kids to perpetuate the farms?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's one that I did always ask. And I found a mix of responses. They felt strongly that they wanted their children to learn. They wanted to offer this as an option. And, one farmer specifically said to me, well, this is always a backup plan. You can always fall back. You know how to grow your own food. And that's a life skill that my kids should know because I know it. But a lot of them, just like most parents, were like, well, I really want my kids to go to college and I want my kids to have options and opportunities. So no one was strictly saying, my children should take over the farm. I don't think there was any pressure there. I think they came to the United States to give their children other opportunities that they didn't have. And so I think a lot of them felt, hey, if I can make a successful business that my children want to take over, that's great. And I did actually see some of that. And in some of the most successful farms, they already had kind of college-age children that had been through the education system, in the US, spoke perfect English, and had decided to help with the farm. And they were the ones that managed all the marketing and the markets. And that was really helpful for those families. But then I had talked to a lot of farmers that were like, oh, I have a daughter. She's learning to be a dental hygienist, and I'm so proud of that. And yeah, if she wants to be part of the farm, great, but it's not required. So I think there was a real mix, like any parent, you want your kid to have options.
Other questions?
Yeah, I was kind of pursuing that one in a little bit different direction too, that it seems like really for cultural values, they're getting into a part of the market that's almost impossible to make a living at. And so that seems like it's even more challenging to get the farm kids to stay on the farm that way. But so looking at at sort of our end in the agricultural education business, as it were, did you see any cases where people did like the farming aspects of it, the children, and had the potential to go to college, but they were interested in going to agriculture rather than into dental hygiene or something that's sort of more obvious ways to find a job? If you saw that, what was driving that?
I did see that a little bit. I can't say there were a lot of cases. I can think of one in Virginia. And I think I think I could speak to more to why I think I didn't see it, is I'm not sure that they know that exists as an option. Because again, I think they're really socially isolated. And so in terms of kind of like what your options might be after high school, I'm not sure a lot of them were hearing, and I could be wrong because I didn't ask that question specifically. But I didn't hear a lot of people talking about, if I'm going to go to school, I'm going to really study agriculture, because their parents are not networked in with the same types of resources that our farmers are. They're not, when I would ask in the USDA office, how do you reach out? They'd be like, oh, well, we have our lists. And if someone comes to our office, they get on our list. And it's like, well, if people never come to your office, they're never going to get on your list. So I don't think their kids at the same time were kind of in the know of what ag schools have to offer. I'd say that's my assumption, because I really didn't hear about it. If they were going to go to college, they were getting away from the farm.
Right.
And if they were going to stay on the farm, they were just excited to stay on the farm and help their parents with so many needs. If they could speak English, they could do so much to help their family just by staying.
No, thanks for that.
LauraAnne, if you look in chat, you'll see that there are a couple of questions there.
Yeah, so I see the one about the Hmong community. So do you think the attitudes might exist among other communities traditionally farming, such as the Hmong? So interestingly, I actually started my dissertation work thinking I was going to work with the Hmong in California, specifically because I had some connections with Extension in Stockton. And I think there are so many similarities with these stories. I realized quickly that I didn't speak Hmong and I spoke Spanish, and I really needed to not spend 3 years learning a new language. But I did do some interviews in Stockton just in the start of this work. And I think there are a lot of overlaps. The biggest difference is that the Hmong community come in as refugees, and the farm worker communities are coming in as undocumented or maybe documented immigrants. So the refugee communities, and I'm doing some work actually with refugees in Syracuse right now. Refugee communities, by no means do they have lots of resources, but they have a different set of resources than other immigrants. And because there are so many, the RAP program, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, has an agricultural funding stream for refugee farmers, and the Hmong farmers have been really successful in taking advantage of those resources, which is great. So I think a lot of their narratives and their histories are the same in terms of why they're farming, why they want to teach their kids to farm. And in Minnesota, I actually saw Latino farmers and Hmong farmers using the same food hub, and there was a relationship there. But I think there's something really different in the refugee groups that come in and they don't work in agriculture in the US, but then they get back into farming because similar to other immigrants, it's what they know. So then it's really different for the Latino groups that are coming in, working in industrial agriculture as their jobs, and then getting into it without any of the networks that the refugees have. So not to say like one group is better off than the other, because it's not easy to be in either group, obviously, to start a farm, but I think they have somewhat different paths to agriculture and different sets of resources and networks. So the Hmong are just more networked in than farm workers are. But yeah, it's a really good question. There's a lot of commonalities there. Did that answer? I can't see who asked it, but what options on how digital agriculture, what are your opinions, on how digital agriculture would influence immigrant farmers, and what could we do from technology aspect to help them? So in terms of digital agriculture, I might just ask, what with digital agriculture do you mean? Like the ways people are using cell phones to track the markets, or other, maybe help me with the question.
Yeah, Laura, this is you. So in terms of a digital agriculture, it's just a new revolution of technology dedicated for agriculture applications. So, for example, instead of using heavy duty agriculture machinery, we probably will use robots. And, just such different, technologies that can reduce, the pesticide applications, stuff like that. So I'm just wondering overall how those technologies would influence immigrant farmers, and how we could do from the technology aspect to help them, if possible.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing I saw was, well, obviously everyone has cell phones. But they don't have a lot of access. So they have cell phones, they don't have access to capital to invest in technology, right? So anything that increases the investment, the edge in terms of investment, usually they would fall behind unless someone is like gifting them lots of money and technology. I did see that there were really simple technologies that could be helpful in terms of, apps to help them with marketing. I actually heard some creative ideas from them, not necessarily specific agricultural technologies, but the ways that they could be using their phones for things like really simple marketing, translation, the more that they could be kind of getting a leg up, because for them, they're really trying to catch up with the technology that already exists because they don't have the money to invest. And in terms of like robotics versus labor, again, I think it largely puts them at a disadvantage because what they have is labor, right? I mean, that's what they have to offer. They have their family, they have themselves. They are the workers. And that's what they have that other farmers don't have, is that they don't have to hire the labor. So I think in a lot of ways, technology, unless they have the money to invest in the technology themselves, which they don't, it's hard to imagine how technology can help them unless it's specifically technology that helps them with these barriers that they're already struggling with, So let's see. So as far as other questions, I can just go back to the chat. Let's see if I could see who's still here. It looks like, okay, so Elizabeth is still here. Can you speak to some of the differences you noticed among your respondents? Did you notice that region, gender, years in the US shape experiences of becoming farm operators? Yeah, definitely. The longer that they had been in the US, and I'd say the longer that their community had been established in the US, the more established that they were as farmers, right? The easier time that they had. And so I think that was really different regionally. So the community that I worked with in the northern neck of Virginia was a group of farmers that had come in the 1980s. Many of them had been through the legislation where they got legal status in the 80s. They just had these really established small scale farms. They had come in as berry migrants. And they had already kind of multiple generations. They really, they had more a sense of the market and what they were doing. And they also owned land because it's just inexpensive to own land in certain parts of Virginia. That varied a lot with what I was seeing in California. So in California, even though there are many generations of, Mexican and Latino immigrants, I saw that there were the immigrant farmers there were largely indigenous from Mexico. They were newer immigrants. They were younger. In California, it's just so hard to own land. Even really established farmers don't own land. They rent land. You have the whole issue of water access. So they were just in a very different situation regionally in terms of saturation of markets and access to resources. And they were a newer set of farmers. So it really, and that's just kind of two examples that really contrasted. But, it really did depend. And then at the same time, I saw a lot of commonalities. A lot of them, they were still had the same goals for their farms in terms of keeping it small and diverse and direct markets. So I don't know if that answers, I mean, there's a lot of other kind of factors there, but I'd say region definitely did matter. Let's see. I think the next question. From Richard. There are many examples of Latino farmers working their way into partnerships or transitions with ongoing or retiring American farmers, the same who are their current or former employers. Did you see this as a potentially large scale pathway to farm ownership or immigrant farmers within ambition? Yeah, I mean, and actually thanks for asking, because I didn't really discuss that, but I do think that is the ideal situation. I didn't see it happening very much, although there are some organizations working on that, obviously, like FarmLink, and some of the incubator farms are trying to be that middle path. What I saw was more that farmers were retiring and selling to developers or selling to larger farmers simply because the farm workers couldn't afford to purchase the farm. So it had to be in the few situations where I saw it happening, it had to be a real mission of the current operator. I really want to pass this on to my employees. I really see that I'll take a hit here economically, but it's worth it for me. So I guess I I think that would be ideal to see that happening. But it's unfortunately, I think the farmers in a lot of cases have to be willing to make less money on the property. And of course, it's not like farmers have a ton of money that they're making at this point. So I think it's a hard one unless there was some kind of subsidy for that transaction, which, that could happen and that would be great. So did that answer?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. And I know we're going to meet later today, so we can talk about more. I think that was all the questions I see on here.
Hi, Laura, and I have a question. Thank you so much for this talk. I actually got the opportunity to interview a local organic farmer in Pennsylvania because I'm working on this podcast project. And she had brought up this article by Chris Newman, who writes about indigenous foodways in North America, and talked a little bit about how the industrial farm complex, the way that we have thousands of acres that are in production for commodity crops, which is very different from what these small diversified farms are, is a way of almost holding the land that has been stolen from the indigenous farmers that had farmed it for generations. So I was wondering if in your research you had come across anything like that and any ways that our farm system could become more sustainable with these smaller diversified farms, or if really, because in the middle of the country, the land is a lot cheaper, but the fear is that as these older farmers age out, the larger corporations are going to end up just buying it and consolidating even more land.
Right. I mean, and that is what we've seen happening, is this consolidation of the land, especially in the Midwest. So, I mean, I guess is the question then, do we see anything other than that happening? Like, is there a pattern that's going against that?
Yeah, I would want to see some kind of positivity.
I mean, I'd say yes, I think in pockets. And I think what is hopeful to me about my study is that I do not think that these farmers have been captured in terms of studies before. So something I didn't talk about is the ways that the USDA doesn't capture these farmers. And so I think the numbers are actually much higher. So most of the farmers that I spoke with are really off the grid in terms of, they usually rent from someone else, and the person they're renting from is the one that fills out the census. And they may or may not be reporting that this farmer is just renting a few acres here and there because it's so informal for many of them. Not everyone, but a lot of it was very informal. And, I'm hopeful, all right, I definitely believe it's happening all over the country. I think as far as the kind of resistance to our current food system on a large scale, I do think we're going to have to create more structural support for farmers like this because they're struggling. And it's happening, but it's happening against these odds. And so I think for us to have large scale transfer of land, there has to be some kind of structural solution too. It can't just be ad hoc how it's happening now. And I think the social movements that we see in, agricultural social movements and immigration movements like support that. I think there's a large social movement among beginning and new farmers that wants to see these, long-term inequalities addressed, from colonization to slavery to, immigrants today. But I think it's going to take a lot of political will to make a really big structural difference, right? And it doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to support the movements doing the work. But it's, there's a push right now. I just saw an article this morning to get the Biden administration, to actually support African-American farmers, right? And so I think there's a lot more talk about these things right now. And I think there's a lot more talk and pressure, and that helps create the political will. So I'm hopeful today, more so than I was a few months ago about it.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was an awesome answer.
Thanks.
Anybody else?
Just wanted to say thank you. I had a chance to ask LauraAnne a few questions this morning, so I didn't want to steal any more airtime, but I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thank you for coming twice.
Yeah, and you and I have some time later, so
okay, great.
I'm
I'm looking forward to it.
Hi, I have one more question.
Yeah.
Well, this was an awesome talk. This is like the first seminar I actually attended this semester. And I was just wondering, like, what made you want to do your research on, new immigrant farmers? Like what was, I guess, the reason behind that? I don't know, the drive.
So it started actually when I was an undergraduate at Cornell. I went and did some work in Guatemala. And I was looking at permaculture and indigenous farming systems there. And then when I was really interested in kind of traditional farming and sustainable food systems. And then when I came back to the US, I thought, okay, I really want to go work on a farm and try farming. And I moved out to California to work on farms. Well, I did some in New York, and then I went to California. And what I really found is, rather than wanting to be a farmer myself, because I recognized how hard it was, is I was really fascinated in the connection between the Guatemalan farmers, the Mayan farmers, and all the farm workers on the farm that I worked with in California. And that they were really they were all essentially indigenous to Central America and Mexico, that they were all farmers, right? But that this one group was, farming in Guatemala. This other group had immigrated to the US to work on like a big and, organic farm in California. But they really had the same background. They talked about agriculture in the same ways. So for me, I was really interested in that connection between, small scale agriculture in Latin America and then farm workers in the US, and how do we highlight all the knowledge that farm workers come to the US with? So rather than just seeing them as workers, how do we see them as people with knowledge that contribute to the food system? So that was kind of how I got started on the path to this project.
Cool, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I just, I don't know, I'm like first generation born here. My family's from El Salvador. And my grandma was a farmer then, but the Civil War started there, and we're in New York City, and it's just like now I'm like a new transfer student at Cornell studying like plants and agriculture, and because it's something I'm really interested in. And I don't know, I think it's really cool that there's like there's just so many different ways things could have gone. And I don't know, I think immigration is in farming is really important. They're really like the population that's doing most of the farming here in the US now. People don't really want to farm anymore, but it's like, this is the backbone of our country. Like, this is what we eat and stuff. And I don't know, this talk was really, really cool. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said. Thanks so much.
I should get that. Bye.
Bye.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.